Well, welcome. My name is Michael Skoll, president of the Venezuelan American Association of the U.S. I am delighted for this webinar to welcome Michael Stott, the Latin American editor of the Financial Times, and I have found one of the most astute observers and reporters on the Latin American situation, particularly Venezuela. The fact is that we could have done this webinar a couple months ago because he predicted exactly what would happen, but I'm getting ahead of myself. What I would like to do is to start with a remarkable video, 2 minutes, produced by the Venezuelan opposition. There's no sound here that we're able to get, but the impact is clear enough. It projects the kind of emotion, and I think it's an excellent start to this conversation. Okay, Laura, you can play the video. Well, the message was clear. The people want change. They will not rest until they get it. And I think you felt the emotion of that. I want to thank Temi Lopez for sending that to me. He's the producer director of the film In Progress, Combate, which we will get to in another webinar soon. Okay, Michael, what's the situation? What's next?
Thank you, Michael, for the invitation and the opportunity to talk to the association. I thought I'd give you a few quick thoughts from the nearly 2 weeks I spent in Caracas until my visa expired and was not renewed. The first, I think, pre-election, it's important to underline the incredible sense of hope and optimism, actually, that there was being felt in the country, the excitement that perhaps, maybe against all the odds, a peaceful democratic change was possible. I was with Maria Corina, went with her to Maracaibo for her final rally there. And along the way, on the journey, through the small towns we went, people would come out spontaneously, mob her motorcade, show their support. Sort of groups of motorcyclists would form spontaneously around her to escort her through the towns. And the police would stand back. They were impotent, really, in front of that demonstration of people power and didn't try to stop or interfere at all. actually looked quite intimidated, just limited themselves to taking pictures. So there was this extraordinary sense of hope. It was clearly mixed with quite a lot of foreboding and realism about what might happen. And then, of course, sure enough, the worst fears were realized, on election night and shortly afterwards. And so, we're now in a situation which many people had predicted, where Maduro stole the election. He stole it more blatantly, I think, than many expected, because, of course, the popular will was so clear and the voters' will was so clear. I toured Caracas on voting day, went to many different voting stations in different areas of Caracas. That the degree of revulsion at the government, at Maduro in particular, was extraordinary. I mean, you weren't left in the slightest doubt, and going to poorer areas too, about how much people wanted change. There wasn't a shadow of doubt about that. Of course, the other thing that happened in the background was there were quite a lot of people betting on a normalization. I'm talking here about business community, some of the business community left in Venezuela, but also investors abroad, people, some of the bondholders, some of the people involved in the oil industry who had been assigned licenses by the Biden administration, individual sanctions exemption licenses. So there was quite a constituency of people here who were convinced, or had convinced themselves, that, Maduro could run a more or less free election. He might cheat a bit, but it wouldn't look too bad. And in the end, the US and the Europeans would recognize him because everybody would move on. And so actually they would then get a fillip, and they might be able even to get a debt restructuring or a major expansion of the oil industry. And this was a bet worth making. So there was also a constituency there betting on some degree of normalization after the election. Of course, now all of that looks very complicated after such a blatant steal, a steal that was done in a fairly crass manner, really with even minimal attempts at sort of covering it up. And that, of course, has posed a problem for all of those who were interested in or betting on normalization. It's interesting to note the rather slow and flat-footed international response from the US and the European Union, it has to be said. Surprising in view of the fact that this scenario was a scenario that was quite predictable and that many people had indeed foretold. And yet there was this sort of almost reaction. I mean, in one forum I was in, there were senior administration officials saying that this was a new situation, that they needed to reevaluate everything now. They needed time. They need to look at it. Very odd in the light of the fact this was so obvious. Clearly, the Europeans and the Americans very constrained by the failures of the past, by the feeling that on the one hand, maximum pressure sanctions, and on the other, a strategy of negotiation for a free or fair election, have both failed. And so what on earth are you left with? Which is difficult. And I think that's also what's constraining the EU and the US from recognizing Edmundo González as president-elect. Maduro has already quite astutely come out in his narrative and emphasized, we've seen the show before, this is Guaido 2.0. Maduro has said that repeatedly. And it's quite a clever strategy on his part, because it clearly is something that alarms the Europeans, the Americans. It spooks them. It reminds them of the failures of the past. They don't want to repeat it. And hence the US's rather awkward position yesterday, reiterated by the State Department, that yes, we think he won the most votes, but no, we're not recognizing him as president-elect, which is difficult. It's a difficult position to be in. It's not great for the opposition either. And then, of course, Maduro has launched this very vicious repression. And I think it's worth underlining just how great the climate of fear is in Caracas now. That video was a video of bravery and defiance, and reflects, a will among the people. But the reality on the streets of Caracas, really, as from Monday night onwards, is one of tremendous fear. And from my hotel window on Monday, I could see in the afternoon smoke from tear gas rising in multiple points all over the city as protests erupted spontaneously. This is not yesterday, but the previous Monday, the day after the election. However, there was very rapid and vicious repression by the security forces, which included the firing of live ammunition at people who were attempting to approach Miraflores in the center. A lot of videos were widely shared of the brutality of the police that day. And Tuesday, the streets were quiet. Tuesday, Wednesday, the streets were absolutely deserted. There was no tear gas clouds visible from my window over any part of the city on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And people were staying indoors. They were very frightened. And of course, now Maduro has launched this big arrest program, Operation Knock Knock. He's telling people not to use WhatsApp. And there have been somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 arrests. A very large number, a lot of talk that Cubans are being used to help direct this operation, in some cases make the arrests. There were several plane loads of Cubans flown in before the election. So it's a scenario of full-on repression, and clearly one that, you know, Maduro is not uncomfortable with. He's not uncomfortable with the idea of international isolation. He's survived it before. He survived maximum pressure sanctions. He survived the EU, the US, and much of Latin America turning against him. And he did so with enormous help from Russia, China, Iran, his main allies, in Cuba. And I think, you know, there's a high degree of confidence he can do that again. So this doesn't leave the opposition with a lot of options. They are trying to appeal to the military and the police to switch sides, which is clearly a bet worth trying. But one has to also say we've seen that before too. And we remember that, you know, the uprising that Guaido and Leopoldo Lopez launched on the streets of Caracas was supposed to be designed to trigger a military uprising, a mutiny against the government. It didn't happen. Padrino, the defense minister, Vladimir Padrino, was supposed to switch sides as part of that deal, didn't, stayed loyal. And as far as one can tell, in the aftermath of this election, Padrino and the military are standing foursquare behind Maduro once again. And all of their public statements and their messaging and the choreography of the appearances has been one of complete, total unity. So one has to question whether it will really prove possible for the opposition in that scenario to peel off the military and the police against the government. So I think we would all wish we were in a different place right now, but the reality is a rather dark one at the moment. I think it has to be said. And with that, I think I'd conclude.
Let me add that anyone who wants to ask a question, please press the Q&A button, write your question, and we'll get to them a little later in the program. Michael, you used the phrase flat-footed to describe the response of the Biden administration now and in the past. I would have used several other stronger terms about the how the Biden administration has misread and misacted continuously vis-a-vis Venezuela. Do you see any real chance that external pressure, internal pressure is going to really move Maduro along?
I think it would be worthwhile considering an increase in targeted sanctions against individuals, particularly individuals in the security forces and the military. There have been a few of those so far. There could be an awful lot more. And I think that is something that bothers regime members. It is something that bothers the military. The European sanctions list is fairly short, actually. It could be a lot longer. So that's a clear path that could be used. But at the moment, it's not one, as far as I could tell, that's even being discussed, which is disappointing. Clearly, broader sanctions, there are more difficult questions about the wider impact. But again, I think one would have to say that the Biden administration's easing of some of the sanctions over the past year and the licenses given to Chevron, Repsol, and others have indeed led to an increase in oil production. But I'd have to say, after spending a couple of weeks in Caracas, it doesn't look to me as though much of that money is trickling down to the people of Venezuela. I think it's certainly made life easier for the wealthy and for the connected, but I would really question whether it's benefited the country very much. So one has to also ask whether, you know, sanctions relief actually works as a policy too, in terms of helping ordinary Venezuelans.
And what about Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, the so-called neighbors who are often called upon to negotiate or to pressure? It seems to me that in the case of Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, under their current governments, with neighbors like these, who needs distant friends? Lula especially. How do you characterize these three countries vis-a-vis Venezuela?
I would say they've not covered themselves in glory so far. it's lamentable, I think, that they didn't feel able to vote for the resolution at the OAS on Venezuela. They essentially torpedoed it by abstaining, which undermined the OAS at a crucial moment, which I thought was unnecessary. I think this continued focus on producing the returns, the tallies from voting stations, we've moved well beyond this now. Maduro has already proclaimed himself president. He's already been given a certificate of victory by the Electoral Council. He's creating facts on the ground. And just to give him more time to produce what would almost certainly be falsified returns at this point is absurd. I mean, I think to continue insisting on that really is not to recognize the sort of realities in Venezuela. So that's not very realistic. And then this talk about negotiation, I struggle a little bit to see what that negotiation would look like. I mean, there've been some talk about repeating the election, which I think is a bit of an insult to the Venezuelan people, frankly, who went along with the whole plan sponsored by the Americans and members of the international community to have an election, to put their trust in the ballot box for regime change peacefully. They did that. The Venezuelan people played completely by the rules. They were defrauded. The result was stolen from them. And then to be told, we'll do it all again. I mean, I think that's very difficult, personally. I don't really see how that could work. And then this idea that, well, we can talk to Edmundo because he's sort of okay, but we can't talk to Maria Corina because she's really beyond the pale. I mean, again, with what right could you say that to the Venezuelan people? Those votes were very clearly votes for Maria Corina. She led the campaign. She was the public figure. She was the visible face of the opposition. She rallied the opposition round, ran an extraordinary campaign, showed tremendous personal energy and courage. Whether or not you agree with her political platform or not is another matter. But I mean, it's undeniable the votes were hers. And so again, to try to suggest that that she could somehow be kept apart from these negotiations, not be part of them because she's not reasonable enough, I mean, again, seems to me to be an insult to the Venezuelan people and what they've expressed at the ballot box. So I really struggle. I mean, you can understand why people like talking about negotiation, but I can't quite see what this negotiation actually consists of at this point.
Well, then you have Maduro claiming that he can't yet produce all of the proven votes because of a cyber attack from North Macedonia. This would be funny comic book stuff if it weren't so serious. How do you characterize a so-called leader like Maduro who is able to say that in the face of what's going on?
Well, he clearly felt the need to come up with some sort of explanation. I mean, some people have told me that there was a cyber attack, but that it was organized by the regime. So that was the other twist, that they needed some kind of cover for the fact that the transmission of results from voting stations was interrupted when only a minority of returns had been sent. So this was a sort of cover story they came up with. Whether or not there actually was a cyber attack, I mean, who knows? You know, clearly it was an absurd sort of story. Maduro's really been a bit all over the place. I saw him at a press conference Wednesday last week, where he was lashing out, he was threatening, but then also, you know, at one point said, well, I still want, you know, I'm still open to negotiations. If the Americans want to, if they're prepared to stick to their word, and the problem has been that in the past they've cheated me and they haven't delivered. And of course, that night he published what he said was a text of the Doha Accords, trying to prove that the Americans had not kept their word, which was his sort of spin on this. But I thought it was interesting that he wasn't slamming the door on that. He's obviously a past master at playing for time and negotiating endlessly while giving away very little, and it's worked for him pretty well in the past. So I think he may think that it could work for him again this time. If he offers the carrot of possible negotiation, people will go for it, and that buys him more time, helps him solidify things, helps keep the economy going. Not a bad strategy if you can combine that with repression at home to make sure that you stay firmly in power.
So the bus driver has outwitted the leaders of the free world.
He's a pretty smart operator, I have to say. I think, you know, he was underestimated. Happens very often. We've seen so many examples of that around the world. You know, I think of Vladimir Putin. I spent 4 years in Moscow, and you know, the Russians at the start said Putin was this nobody. He was a sort of mid-level apparatchik from the KGB with no political skills and wouldn't last very long, and so on and so forth. Well, we know how that's ended. So yeah, it's a common mistake to underestimate these guys. I think he's he's clearly astute. He's ruthless. He's he knows what he's doing. He understands how to operate in this context, and he's lasted 11 years already.
So is Venezuela then becoming Cuba or Nicaragua?
The analogy I think of is Iran. And the reason I say Iran is because it's an oil-producing country. It's a much more sizable country. Cuba and Nicaragua are both small. It's highly repressive. It also has a population who totally and utterly rejects and abhor the regime, and who've tried through election and through protest to change the regime, but have not been able to, because the regime has proved extremely effective at repression, and has done so with the help of in Iran's case, the Revolutionary Guards, which is the sort of equivalent of the army and security forces in Venezuela. So that's the sort of parallel I look at. The obvious difference is that it's not theocratic, but I think it's similar in that the theocracy in Iran is actually now less important than the repression and the authoritarian nature of the regime. And likewise in Venezuela, the sort of ideological veneer of Chavismo and socialism is sort of wearing very thin, particularly with the economic shift that Maduro has made towards some liberalization in the economy, which has, as we said earlier, benefited some of the business community and the better connected.
So emigration from Venezuela, is that going to start up massively? Many people have said that the polls show that many Venezuelans say that if Maduro wins again, or if Maduro stays in power, they're going to leave. So are we going to face another massive movement out of Venezuela, more than the 8 million who've left already?
I think we'd have to say, Michael, that it's quite likely. There was a sense with Maria Corina and Edmundo that this was a last chance. It was a last chance to achieve change peacefully and democratically. And if it really looks like it's not going to happen, then you have to say, for many Venezuelans, what's the option? Continued economic stagnation and repression at home, or you try and seek a better life abroad, where in many cases a lot of your family and friends are already. You'd have to bet that there would be an increase in migration. Yes, absolutely.
And where does this all leave the bondholders and oil investors who were betting, as you say, on a Maduro more or less clean victory and normalization?
Well, I think I've been hearing that on the oil side, there's been quite a lot of lobbying going on since the election to try to persuade the Biden administration in particular not to cancel those individual sanctions licenses. And it appears so far to have been successful, because the one thing the administration has said clearly is that they don't plan to cancel those individual sanctions exemption licenses. So that lobbying so far appears to have worked. Whether they'll give more licenses, of course, is another question. There may not be more licenses, but they've given quite a lot already, including some to the likes of BP and Shell, who haven't really done much so far with those licenses. So there is, an opportunity still for Venezuela to increase oil and gas production with the existing licenses. The bondholders, I think things are a little more difficult, because international recognition of Maduro really now, even for the keenest on negotiation, is difficult to advance as a serious proposition. And without international recognition, you don't unlock the money from the IMF, the IDB, and the like that would be necessary for a debt restructuring. So for the bondholders, things look a lot more complicated. For the oil lobby, things look perhaps still reasonably viable.
Well, okay, let me remind everyone, if you want to ask a question, click the Q&A button, and we will get to as many as we can. As a matter of fact, let me look at the questions. Okay, some of the questions have already been answered. Let me ask from Stephen Bodson, what odds do you give Maduro of being president in 1 year?
I would say better than evens. I mean, I think the likelihood is he will still be there in a year.
Okay, from Eric Farnsworth, this is an interesting one. Some are calling for a Nobel Peace Prize for Maria Corina Machado to highlight the democratic fight in Venezuela and put a permanent black mark on Maduro's repression. What are your views on that?
I could see the case for it. I think it might be a little early still. because we don't know quite how all this is going to end. I think so far she's played it very well. She's been very measured, very calm, very restrained, very thoughtful. But she now faces perhaps her biggest test, actually, with the rather equivocal international response and the risk that the unity in the opposition will fracture again. So I think my personal view might be you might want to wait a few more weeks or months before making that nomination. But if she continues to do it as effectively as she has, then I could see a strong case for that, yes.
From Robert Cooper, can anything be learned from Bangladesh, who have finally caused regime change after 15 years of dictatorship?
That was indeed an inspiring example. I think one would have to say that, in that case, people power definitely worked. Sheikh Hasina was not able to contain popular anger, but the military crucially sort of stepped back and let people power flourish. I think in Venezuela, what's happened so far is that there was an attempt to show people power on Monday. It was cracked down on very hard and very quickly. And it hasn't really come back again with force since. So if the military continue to be willing to crack down as hard as they have so far, it's difficult for that sort of people power to gain momentum. Yeah, one would hope that Venezuela could go the Bangladesh way, but the military at the moment is not letting that happen.
Yeah. There's a parallel question here from Frank Gomez. And the role of the military, the troops suffer also under the dictatorship. Of course, my quick answer to that is there's the top of the military, the middle of the military, and the bottom of the military, but I'll let you answer the question.
Yes, so the military clearly crucial here, but I think what's worth noting is the structure of the military, which is unusual, with so many generals at the top, reportedly around 2,000 generals, a really enormous number of generals for an army the size of Venezuela. And many of those generals heavily involved in illicit economic activity, crucially. So illegal mining, drug trafficking, and the like. So they have a strong reason to want to back the regime and a strong reason to fear any kind of process that could leave them vulnerable to prosecution. And so I think it's important to emphasize, we're not just talking about a small number, we're not talking about half a dozen or a dozen military at the top who are in trouble. We're talking about potentially thousands, So that makes it very complicated to imagine any kind of process of negotiation under which the military would be offered incentives, because you might offer pardons and guarantees to a handful, but pardons and guarantees to 2,000 generals, I mean, I don't think there's any precedent for that anywhere in the world, really. And then, of course, you get to the middle and lower ranks. And the degree of loyalty is very difficult to assess, but so far it appears to be holding. And I mean, there's been no visible sign that one can detect of any kind of fracturing. People will tell you that the rank and file are very demoralized and are not standing behind the regime. It doesn't look like it at the moment, is all one can say. As I say, that there's no obvious or visible sign anywhere of fracturing in the military, quite the reverse. I mean, they've so far been standing very firmly behind the regime, and it's hard to see what would change that in the near future.
Well, here's something from Michael McKinley, Ambassador McKinley. It would appear that the initiative by Mexico, Colombia, Brazil is losing steam, and the meeting of Presidents Lula and Boric in Santiago reiterated calls for transparency, but not specific diplomatic steps. How does it look to the opposition in Caracas in terms of mobilizing firmer Latin American pressure on Maduro in real time?
I think the opposition are putting a brave face on the situation. So Maria Corina has thanked Brazil for its help and support, which is clearly, diplomatically speaking, a smart thing to do. If I were Maria Corina, I think I'd be feeling pretty disappointed and pretty worried about the Latin American reaction, but clearly she can't show that at the moment. It wouldn't make any sense to. And she doesn't want to pick a fight with Brazil at this point, not least because the Brazilians have provided a diplomatic flag to help protect 6 of her key campaign aides who were in the Argentine embassy and are now under the Brazilian diplomatic umbrella. So she has to also move carefully with her response. But no, the Latin Americans have been weak, with the exception of Boric. And Boric has been principled and courageous in his stance and was quick to say that the results were not believable at a time when others were just limiting themselves to calling for voting returns. But as I mentioned earlier, I think it's really unrealistic to keep talking about needing to see voting tallies. I mean, we're now more than a week after the election. These tallies are produced automatically by the voting machines on the night. The opposition says it has over 80% of them. The regime has said it has 100% of them. Maduro has said that more than once. So the fact that they've not produced them now 9 days after the election clearly indicates that these results were not favorable to the regime. I mean, it couldn't be clearer, really. And yet we still have plaintively from Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, this sort of call about, oh, produce the voting returns. I mean, it's slightly absurd. And I think the other thing which is unfortunate is that Lula has, whether wittingly or unwittingly, given some cover to Maduro by saying in his comments last week, oh, that it's normal that there's a disagreement about the results of the election, and the way to settle this is in the courts. And Lula said that, if I'm not mistaken, on Tuesday last week, and the day after, on the Wednesday, hey presto, Maduro appears at the Supreme Court with an injunction saying, please, Supreme Court, we want you to settle the election results. And the Supreme Court immediately agrees, which Venezuelan lawyers tell me is constitutionally wrong. The Supreme Court actually has no legal basis upon which to evaluate election results, but they took the case anyway and called all the candidates, and Maduro now claims he's handed over proof of his victory to the Supreme Court, which will, of course, doubtless issue a validation of the result. But by making that original call last week for the courts to settle it, Lula, of course, they say, wittingly or unwittingly, has given cover to Maduro, which Maduro has been very quick to use. So that was also extremely unfortunate, I think one would have to say.
Here's from Patrick Duddy, Ambassador Duddy. Mr. Stott, you paint a grim and discouraging picture. Do you see any regime vulnerabilities that the international community can exploit?
I can only say I wish it were a less grim picture, but the reality is that it doesn't look good. I think that the best chance for international pressure is to consider the possibility of extending these individual sanctions. It would need to be, though, something the Europeans bought into, because a lot of the regime elite are very fond of their homes in Spain, France, Italy, etc., the UK. So if the Europeans don't buy into this and extend their list of targeted sanctions, then I think they would have a limited effect if they were US only. But I think that's probably the most effective avenue of pressure, because it hurts some of those responsible for the repression in an area where they're vulnerable. And it clearly doesn't hurt the rest of the population. And I said, I'm slightly surprised that we haven't seen more focus on that right away. I think it's partly because the whole topic of sanctions is a very difficult one at the moment. And, you know, the maximum pressure campaign was seen to have failed, although it was a different campaign with different strategy, different results, different objectives. But it's made the whole topic of sanctions, it seems to be, slightly toxic diplomatically. And so governments are treating it with extreme reserve. But I think that might be the most promising at the moment.
So prospects for more sanctions, US, EU, this is from Frank Gomez. Your answer is, who cares? Is that it?
Who cares on the side of the Europeans, the Americans, you mean, or?
Yeah.
Or, I'm not sure I understand the question, sorry.
Well, are there prospects for more sanctions from the US or the EU?
Well, we haven't seen any sign that that's on the immediate agenda. One would hope it's something being discussed behind the scenes, but publicly, at least so far, no one's been prepared to say that that's something being considered. And I think one would have to conclude too that from the US and the EU, there's a bit of a sense of, we didn't really want this crisis. We were rather hoping that this would all sort of resolve itself. Again, going back to that scenario of normalization. You know, the US and the EU are grappling with multiple international crises, the Middle East and Ukraine being the most serious, Taiwan not far behind. This is really a crisis they don't want. I mean, they would love for this to go away. And so I think there's also a reluctance to do anything that's going to, that might risk sharpening this crisis or worsening it or inflaming it. And that's a vulnerability that the Maduro government is exploiting to the full.
So it seems that basically the only real criticism and willingness to act in the hemisphere comes from the countries furthest away, Argentina and Chile. Someone asks if Milei could exert any influence. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that the problem with Milei here is that although his instinct was right to sort of say this was a steal right away and say so publicly and denounce it, the difficulty is he has so much ideological baggage from his affinities with the far right, with Bolsonaro, with Trump, with Vox in Spain, that he's a rather toxic figure for anyone really at the moment to be associated with, and that rather undermines what he's trying to do. Gabriel Boric, of course, doesn't have that problem. He's got very respectable credentials as a Democrat and as a human rights advocate. But his difficulty is a slightly different one, which is that he's got an awkward coalition to contend with in Chile. But that constrains him too. And of course, part of his coalition is communist. And the communists in his coalition have backed Maduro and defended the Venezuelan result. So Boric has an awkward political game to play domestically. And I think he's, as I say, been as principled as he can be so far, but it's difficult for him to be a lot stronger on this because of his own coalition constraints. And yesterday, when he appeared with Lula here in Santiago, he was very careful. It was a very carefully worded statement. They didn't take questions. He's clearly tried to avoid falling into any traps here. And then, of course, the other country that was outspoken was Peru. But Peru, again, the democratic credentials are rather weak. And we've got an interim president who was under fire for the deaths of many protesters after she took office, also had a corruption scandal, we remember. So again, not a figure of enormous moral clarity who could speak out on this issue and command immediate respect internationally. It's a very unfortunate sort of international context. And I think, one that clearly delights Maduro and the Chavistas because they sense here a lot of weakness around them, which they can exploit.
Well, here's a question for Pedro Romero. I think I know the answer, but I'll let you answer it. Is there a scenario that you could see where the international community could intervene with boots on the ground if Maria Corina Machado and or Edmundo get arrested by the Maduro regime?
I honestly can't see it. I really can't see it, I'm afraid. I think that's highly unlikely. And I think here at this point, it's probably worth remembering too that this is something Maria Corina in the past has advocated. It was several years ago. She's been very careful to distance herself from that in recent times. She doesn't even want to talk about it or mention it, but Venezuelans remember it, and in particular, the military remember it. And I think this is something else that people have said to me, that for the military, Maria Corina in particular is a problem because of her past advocacy of military intervention, foreign military intervention. And this makes her a very problematic figure for the military to ever consider any sort of deal or negotiation with. And in fact, quite the opposite. I mean, they see a red line there. And I think that's worth mentioning too, because although it's not, as I say, a position she's disassociated herself from recently, in people's memories, that's still there. And that for Chavismo and the military represents a particular problem with Maria Corina.
Here's one from Peter Calderon. Hi, Peter. Given the impotence of diplomatic and political pressure on the Maduro regime, isn't the publicity given the crisis by a documentary film such as Combate and other TV programs a better way to mobilize political opinion to push for regime change?
Yes, I think it's very important to get the message out about what's happening in Venezuela, about the reality of Venezuela. I'm conscious in Europe it's not high on the agenda, if we're honest about it. It's crowded out by the other international crises. I think it does need to be kept there. It needs to be kept there too when the Venezuelan government try to use soft power to project their message. So one thinks here of Gustavo Dudamel and the Sistema and the Youth Orchestra and the concert at Carnegie Hall in New York. I thought it was a clever initiative by human rights groups to send a letter to all the concert goers, reminding them of the context in which this concert was taking place. So that sort of thing, I think, is effective at keeping the story in people's minds, keeping people aware of what's happening there. And I think being very clear that this isn't sort of a contested election or a sort of election about which there's some doubt or we're not quite sure what happened. I mean, it's overwhelmingly clear what did happen. And that needs to be a narrative that's told widely too. There aren't sort of different versions of the truth here. That there is one truth, and then there's a series of falsehoods that are being spread. So I think that's important to keep in people's minds as well.
Frank Gomez asks, will Maduro feel emboldened to seize oil land in Guyana? And if he does?
I think personally that's unlikely at the moment. And mainly because the military is fully occupied with repression. So I don't think they can afford to extend themselves into Essequibo for what would be a very complicated operation. And if there's one thing that might trigger foreign military intervention, it would be a raid on Essequibo. I think that one could say that might be the one thing that would finally force foreign powers to get involved militarily. So I don't think they'll go there. I can't personally see that. But the other thing I think is Maduro is of course more dependent than ever on the military. So on the one hand, he's sounding bellicose and he's cracking down and he's trying to project an image of security. But on the other, the reality is he's much more dependent than ever now on the military, and in particular on the figure of Padrino, who has been in the job 10 years and is now unsackable, really, because of his importance to the regime and his ability to form unity in the top of the army. So Maduro is also constrained by his own dependence on the military, I would say.
Patricio Navia asks, so will Maduro be a pariah for the next few years like Daniel Ortega? Or will his government be treated more like the Cuban Revolution, a dictatorship that people get used to?
I think one would have to say the former. I think even now for the Lulas and Petros and AMLOs of this world, it's pretty difficult to project Maduro as some kind of revolutionary hero. He doesn't have the Chavez credentials. He presided over an economic disaster and a social and human disaster of extraordinary magnitude. A lot of these countries have big Venezuelan diasporas living in them who are showing the people of Brazil, Colombia on a daily basis what the reality of Venezuela is. So I don't think anybody could be remotely romantic about Chavismo and about Maduro and so on at the moment, even if they are ideologically closer on the left. So you would have to say it looks much more like a pariah state. And the crackdown, the repression has also been pretty brutal, pretty clear and pretty obvious and very ugly. And this Operation Knock Knock that's been launched now, I mean, it's sinister in the extreme. So I think, yeah, I mean, even the most sort of ideological Latin American leftists would be very hard pushed to portray Maduro as a revolutionary hero at this point.
When we planned this webinar, when we talked about it a little over a week ago, we were going to focus on the so-called off-ramps, all the things that would be available to people like Maduro and Padrino and the 2,000 generals and others to help them get out, perhaps without indictments, without arrests, what have you. You haven't mentioned, no one has mentioned the off-ramp. So there's no need for an off-ramp right now because they're solidly up on top of the platform they're on. That is the situation right now, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I mean, when one thinks of negotiation, obviously you think of things like that. I think there's a number of practical difficulties. One is, as you say, that they look very ensconced in power at the moment. They don't look vulnerable. But a second obvious one is the US electoral calendar. I mean, if you're Maduro and co, are you going to sit down really with the Biden administration right now when you have no idea whether they're going to be in power in January or not? And you don't know what Kamala Harris's position is on Venezuela? I mean, clearly, no, right? You're going to play for time. You're going to wait and see what the result of the American election is. I can't really see a serious prospect of negotiation in that sort of environment. And then the other difficulty is the one I alluded to earlier, that the number of people who would need to be covered by some sort of off-ramp is huge. I mean, we're not talking about Maduro's cabinet. We're talking about, say, potentially a few thousand people in the army and top of the army.
There's a lot of money, an extraordinary amount of money was stolen, and placed in banks or in Europe and in the U.S. And if you walk down 57th, 58th Street in New York City, you will look up and see 100-story buildings with at night whole air floors black, dark, because they're owned by Venezuelans who can't get into the country. So there's an awful lot of money. There's an awful lot of reason for the continuation of the status quo. And I believe that number, 2,000 generals. Does the U.S. have 2,000 generals? I don't think so.
I'm not sure. I honestly don't know. I'm not an expert on the US military, but it is an extremely large number for the size of the armed forces in Venezuela. And I think to your point about assets, I mean, the illegal assets, if they're substantial in the US, they're even bigger in countries like Spain. And I think, as probably many of your members know, there's whole areas of Madrid which are full of Venezuelans, both members of the opposition and also regime-connected people. And those regime-connected folk are enjoying their ill-gotten gains in Spain and also France and the UK, it has to be said, in Italy, with impunity at the moment, and are able to travel there, live there, have their families there, have their kids study there. I'm told that Jorge Rodriguez's children study in the UK, for example. So, you know, all this stuff is going on in plain view, if you like. And I think that's where the Europeans could be doing a great deal more to make life difficult for people at the top of the regime. And I'm a little puzzled as to why that isn't happening.
Okay, we've gotten an answer about the number of generals in the U.S., both from Patricio Navia and Ambassador McKinley. The total number of active duty general officers is capped at 231 or 219 for the Army, 62 for the Marine Corps, 198 for the Air Force, and 162 for the Navy, and that comes from Wikipedia, so you know that it's honest. So in other words, Venezuela does have far more generals than the U.S. has generals and admirals, which gives you a flavor of the distortion that has gone on. And it's a protective distortion for a continuation of the status quo in Venezuela.
Absolutely, Michael. And of course, you know, the great majority of those generals have been promoted by Padrino. I mean, he's been running the military for the last 10 years, and every year he's promoted around 100 more people, military, to the rank of general. So these are people who have a direct link to Padrino, who he's chosen, who he has favored with promotions. So, you know, that's how he's extended his control across the top of the armed forces.
Do you have any thoughts on the differences between possible differences between Biden and Kamala and Trump on Venezuela, or is that pure speculation?
I think it would have to be speculation at the moment, to be honest with you. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think we know very little about Kamala Harris's positions on Venezuela so far. I'm not sure that we've heard anything much from her on that. Trump has obviously talked about how it's a dictatorship. He backed Guaido very strongly, but the maximum pressure campaign did fail, and he you know, considered invasion, we're told in some of the books, and was talked out of it. One hesitates to see a little bit what his strategy would be this time. So yeah, I think there isn't much clarity, frankly, around that at this point.
So we are reaching a conclusion of this conversation on an extraordinarily pessimistic note. Is there anything, Michael, that would, in your opinion, lighten up this conversation in any way?
I mean, one can always hope, Michael, that the people power proves strong enough and enduring enough that the military switch sides. I think one thing people have observed is that this time round, the vote against Chavismo was much stronger in poorer neighborhoods than it ever has been before. And those are the neighborhoods where a lot of the rank and file military and security forces live. So that is much more difficult for them. They're being asked to repress, if you like, their own neighbors instead of repressing people in wealthier neighborhoods, which was the pattern in the past. So there could be a point at which the military and security forces rank and file, as opposed to the generals, their resolve wavers, and they start to decide that, in fact, this is not something they want to do any longer. But it hasn't happened so far, is all one can say. And there've been plenty of videos shared of rank and file security forces beating and dragging away demonstrators and going house to house and snatching people and taking them away. So they haven't shown any signs so far of being reluctant to do that. But if there is going to be change in Venezuela, one would have to say it's going to have to come from the street and the pressure of the street, eventually tipping over rank and file military. I mean, but I mean, there isn't any sign one can seize on at the moment that's happening, which isn't to say it won't happen. So I think, you never say never, right? You can never predict these things. And that might be a possibility. But I would hope that in the meantime, the international community could consider more in terms of targeted measures against people responsible for particular abuses of human rights or particular acts of egregious corruption or pilfering of state resources. I think there's a lot more that could be done there. And I'd stress, I'm saying this, of course, in a personal capacity. This is not the editorial policy of the newspaper, and all the comments I've made today are personal and not those of the newspaper, and shouldn't be taken to represent those of the newspaper. It's an important point that I should have made at the outset. But I think that is one area that could be looked at.
Keeping on your personal opinion, is there something you would say to the potential and actual investors in Venezuela, petroleum and otherwise?
Caveat emptor, I think, is what I would say. Some of them I heard in the last couple of months saying, oh, you're going to see this will all work out fine. There might be a little bit of turbulence along the way, but actually it's no big deal, and you're going to see this will all work out very nicely. And I have to say it doesn't look like that to me at the moment. So I think, unless and until the Chavista government shows a real sign of wanting to loosen its grip on power, which it absolutely hasn't done so far, I think you'd have to be rather foolish to consider putting serious money on the table in the meantime.
Isn't it something of trying to extract oil from an empty barrel?
To some extent, yes, I think so. I mean, clearly, again, there's been a sort of attempt to exploit the fact that the Biden administration want to try and prise Venezuela away from the Russian and China sphere of influence. Well, good luck with that. I mean, at the moment, it certainly doesn't look that way. Russia and China were the first to congratulate Maduro on his victory, Iran too. And, those bonds are stronger than ever at the moment. So it doesn't look like a very successful policy at this point. But, that was, I think, a little bit the intention. It's really not succeeding.
Okay, this one from Lena Delgado. Mike, congratulations. The webinar is excellent. The speaker demonstrated extensive knowledge about the current situation in Venezuela. Kudos to the VAUS team and the board of directors. Thank you, Lena. And you might want to thank her too, Michael.
Well, that's very kind of you, Lena. Thank you very much.
Well, Michael, I don't want to keep at this on and on because it's pessimistic, it's bleak, it's very disappointing. I had hoped that we would have a conversation by this time of something better for Venezuela, something better for U.S. and other policy vis-a-vis Venezuela. But this doesn't look like it's going to happen, and I don't know when anything will change. Do you have any final comments about this situation?
Well, I'd say, Michael, not to leave this on a totally pessimistic note. I think it's important to remember the positives, that the opposition ran an extraordinarily successful campaign, one which clearly really rattled the regime. It was one that showed tremendous unity, very effective messaging, a message of optimism and of hope. They kept that unity and that messaging throughout. And I say in the immediate aftermath, I think the strategy was clever around the election. They knew there was a high risk of fraud and stealing. So they organized this incredible citizen mobilization to defend the vote, which allowed them to collect 80% of the tally sheets and produce different results. So it was really a model. I mean, I think, again, you have to recognize that. It was remarkably well done. It's hard to see anything else the opposition could have done, frankly. So I think all of that is worthy of praise, of recognition, and of being remembered. And you know, Eric's suggestion about the Nobel Peace Prize clearly comes from that. I think, you know, you can certainly see that. So I think it's important not to forget that. The hope is that now the opposition can sustain some kind of momentum, can keep that unity, cannot dissolve into faction fighting and recrimination, which is obviously a huge risk, and can try to keep a campaign of civil resistance alive. And, you know, I think one would hope, for the sake of the Venezuelan people, that can happen, and that it draws sustained international support, and that through that way there may still be some light at the end of the tunnel, even if it's a long and dark tunnel. So I wouldn't for a moment suggest we should give up at this point. Quite the opposite. But you know, it is a difficult juncture. But we should remember the positives about the opposition. It has been a quite remarkable campaign. Extraordinary courage, great energy, great imagination, and very clever strategy and planning. And it did definitely have the Chavistas rattled. So, you know, let's not forget that too, in the sort of bleakness of the moment.
Well, thank you, Michael. This has been interesting, but as I say, depressing. I want to thank Laurie Dominguez for the technical support for all of this. VOWST will continue to focus on Venezuela, and I think we will probably support Eric Farnsworth's notion of a Nobel Peace Prize for Maria Corina Machado, although I don't know how many people will be listening to that. It's a great idea. Michael, thank you very much. Let's do this again, hopefully at a time when things have changed in Venezuela. We continue to support democracy, human rights there as elsewhere. I'm sure you do, and we will talk again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, Michael, and thank you to everybody who attended.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.